Live from Dearborn, this is the Locked Tomb podcast. I'm Amy.
And I'm Mel.
We're rereading Gideon the Ninth by Tamsin Muir. Today we'll be covering Gideon the Ninth, chapters 12 through 16, in which Gideon meets the sixth house, finds Harrow in a bone, fights a construct with arms a little bit like swords, attends a bad dinner party, and works with Harrow to complete their first challenge. It's a lot to cover.
It is so much to cover, but before we do that, Amy, what kind of instruments do they play on the ninth house?
What kind of instruments, Mel?
Trombones!
No. Oh boy. Magnus would be so proud.
Yes, the king of puns would be so proud. I did that one for him.
This one's for you, Magnus. Well, on that note, we start out with chapter 12. Basically, I feel like this chapter starts out as Gideon is having a hard time fitting in at her new school. Like, that's just the whole vibe.
Yeah, Gideon's got no friends.
Yeah.
And even her enemy, she doesn't even have her enemy around.
Yeah, it's not a good time for Gideon. However, Dulcinea is being flirty. Everyone else, hates Gideon, or avoids Gideon at least. But Dulcinea is
thirsty.
Really, really into Gideon. She's thirsty. There's a bit in here that I thought was so funny and so gay. And I feel like I've had this exact same fantasy about girls I've liked. And it's when Gideon is talking about how she's had this fantasy about Harrow getting a newspaper in the future where Gideon's on the front page having been a hero in a battle. And Harrow's like, wow, I guess she really could swing a sword. I've had that fantasy.
Of course. This long lost, I wasn't able to attend my 15-year reunion because I'm off doing something important, but that person I had a crush on who's at the reunion finds out through someone else that I'm off doing something important.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. Yeah. So the chapter very quickly gets into... So Gideon hasn't seen Harrow in a couple of days, and starts to become a little bit suspicious of this and decides to go search for Harrow. Doesn't find her anywhere, eats some lunch, goes and searches again, and comes across, in an area that she hadn't really been in before, the sixth house.
The sixth house, which is Palamades, Sextus, and Camilla. And let me tell you, this is just a recurring theme. The first read through, I could not follow who was in what house. And even though Tamsin Muir gives us clues in the names, like Sextus, sixth house. That's how you can remember Palamades. Sextus is the sixth house, and Camilla is his cavalier.
Wait, is it Palamades?
Is it Palamades?
I thought it was Palamades.
Palamades. It's Palamades.
Ah.
That was my American coming out, my really American
Palamades.
Palamades. Palamades. Yes. But these are two of the straight up best people.
They're so good.
And Palamades is also one of the few solidly good humans in this book.
Yeah.
A lot of these characters are pretty awful, but Palamades is got such a good heart, and that comes out in all these cute ways.
Yeah, and I would say Camilla too is a good person. They're both good people.
Yeah,
I feel like they have kind of a. We can discuss this in length later. I feel like they have a weird relationship, but they're obviously love each other so much and are just such good people and are so kind to Harrow and Gideon. It's really nice.
Yep.
And Gideon shows up, really scares Palamades and Camilla because she's this big robed figure standing at the top of these stairs. And she has this really quick fight with Camilla, who, jumps on her to protect Palamades. We learn that Camilla is an incredible fighter.
This is if this was a movie, it would be a quick fight montage, of Camilla doing backflips and all the sweetest,
Yes.
most cliche sword moves that you could imagine. But Gideon is so awed by Camilla's fighting. I love how Gideon, when she's in these fights, is like constantly kind of in awe of who she's fighting and is appreciating them as a fighter. It's cute.
Yeah, she really likes to actually be challenged, for sure. I did want to mention, so there's a bit where, so before Gideon actually comes down and sees Palamades and Camilla, or they haven't seen her yet, they're talking about the age of the building, and Palamades is using, shoot, I forget like the magical term, but he can tell because of the thanergy that's left in an object how old it is. And he's saying that this object, like a piece of rock, is like, 10,000 years older than this object. And it seems to be like some sort of weird discrepancy that he doesn't understand.
Yep. I reread that multiple times to try and understand what he was getting at. And all I could land on is that there is a discrepancy, but we're not totally sure why or why it's even important. But even a little bit later on, Harrow says to Gideon that Palamades is obsessed with aging or dating Canaan House.
Yeah.
And so we know that the laboratories, which we're about to kind of enter in this chapter, are pre-resurrection. So really, really old, like older than 10,000 years. And that Canaan House is not as old as the like ground floor laboratories. I think that's all we know about the age of the building.
Yeah. I wonder if this is kind of a weird discrepancy because before the resurrection and like therefore maybe even before the mass extinction event that I think created necromancy, I'm wondering if this laboratory actually existed before the mass extinction event. And that's why it's kind of weird because it's actually like pre-necromancy. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. It's definitely pre-mass extinction. But what is that? But we don't really know what Palamades is like picking up on.
Yeah, it's something around that.
Something.
So after this fight, though, with Camilla, basically Palamades infers that, even though Gideon's not saying anything, infers that Gideon is looking for Harrow. Gideon breaks her vow of silence to say, get off your ass and help me.
Love it.
Which is a great reason to break your vow of silence. And Palamades uses his keys to let her into the facility, which is where we spend a lot of time in these books. In this book. In this book specifically. So we enter this facility, which is, I think it's like a laboratory. It's like a weird military-esque. I think of it as like in movies, in like Marvel movies, where there's like an underground military facility with where like, it's like that. That's my impression. Very industrial.
That's how I picture it too. And with like an eerie green light, as you walk down the hall, things kind of like come on.
When I think that there's a bit later where it describes when you walk down the hallway, the lights will like thunk, thunk, thunk on like as you go. And that's so creepy to me. Like that they don't all turn on at once, but they kind of like follow you.
Also, like, where's the electricity coming from? I thought this planet had no one on it. I'm a little bit like, what is powering this laboratory to even work? Because it feels like it's electricity down there with the lights. So how does that work?
There must be a generator or something.
A 10,000-year-old generator. I mean, anything is possible on the Nine Houses.
Yeah, maybe it's been preserved with like thallergy or something.
I'm curious, Amy, when they go down, there's something written on the chalkboard, and I think it's scrawled on the chalkboard, "It is finished." And I still don't, I'm sure maybe it comes up in Harrow and we get like more insight, but what is that?
It does, I think that, I don't know if this is the only time it says, so they go down, on the board is like it's like a whiteboard basically. And on the bottom corner, it says "It is finished," which is totally a biblical reference because "it is finished" is one of the last things that Jesus says when he's about to die, which is interesting. And it's like, I mean, it's obviously I'm pretty sure this isn't just a coincidence. This is a biblical reference. And I think it's interesting because it doesn't mean like it is finished, like I'm about to die. It means that sacrifice is finished. I've paid to like let people live forever, basically, which is exactly what the Cavaliers do. The work is finished. They have sacrificed themselves so that their necromancers can be immortal, which is like a really interesting parallel.
Yeah.
I might be reading into this too much, but I'm pretty sure that was deliberate.
I don't think you're reading into it. I feel like Tamsin Muir says there's all sorts of, but it's like all biblical. So much of it is biblical.
Yeah, for sure. After these three goons go down into the facility to look for Harrow, and Palamades basically immediately leads Gideon to Harrow by following a trail of Harrow's blood. And Harrow has encased herself in a bone.
I missed that, like, originally. I was like, what is it? I could not even picture what Harrow was inside or how it was created or why. Now, I'm pretty sure, and you can tell me because you've read this 8 more times than I have.
Yep.
Harrow makes the bone to help heal herself, right? It's part of like her own self, like regenerating kind of energy situation because she has basically worked herself to the point where she is completely unable to move and she needs to actually like heal before she can keep working.
Yeah, I always thought of it as sort of like a protection thing. Like she knew that she was getting weak. I mean, she like passed out, woke back up, made this bone cocoon so that she could basically take a nap inside a bone and like so that the bone would protect her. Although Gideon just like kicks it apart. So I don't know like what.
Yeah, Gideon kicks it apart and Palamades is like kind of horrified by that and then goes over and like measures one of the bone fragments. He's like, he very clearly is infatuated with how amazing of a necromancer Harrow is. And we kind of learn that in this chapter with subtle things that he says.
Yeah, he definitely knows that Harrow is incredibly talented.
Yeah, and he gets off on that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. Also, I forgot that there's this bit when Palamades is talking about how Harrow's blood is on the floor down there and it hasn't skeletonized yet. And Gideon basically goes berserk. And I think this is why I feel like it's fairly obvious from the very beginning that Gideon is like really cares about Harrow.
Yeah.
She doesn't let herself admit it to herself, but she's really worried about Harrow and really protective. It's pretty funny.
It's cute.
So Gideon ends up taking Harrow back up out of the facility and back to their quarters. And then we have a whole chapter of Gideon and Harrow basically having a little chat. And it's really pretty cute.
And it comes at such a good time because, you know, Gideon is craving some sort of conversation with literally anyone. And then as the reader, you're also craving that for Gideon. And when I read this chapter, I just felt so much relief by the end of it that they were like maybe going to work together. And that just felt so good. But this chapter is really nice because you get, again, like a more intimate look into what their relationship is and how it's going to be evolving throughout the whole rest of the book. And there's something that Harrow says to Gideon where she basically like validates Gideon punching Nibirius in the face.
Oh, yeah. Uh-huh.
Which I fucking loved. I loved that.
Yeah.
It was like, wow, you just got that validation. Like, yeah, you should have punched him in the face. But then she's also saying to Gideon, don't hang out with the 7th house. So basically, don't hang out with Dulcinea.
Mm-hmm.
And Gideon's, sort of taken aback and is like, Dulcinea's dying. Like there's what could possibly be threatening about this person. And Harrow says she picked an interesting place to die. So already Harrow is sort of suspecting that Dulcinea is dangerous. And maybe doesn't know everything, but is definitely like, there's something up with this person that they can't be trusted.
Yeah, well, I think it's implied later that it's implied almost from the very beginning that Harrow knows that Protessa is puppeted. I think she, well, not knows, but suspects that Protessa is puppeted. And there's also like, I don't know if it's in this section or another, where Harrow basically is like, I don't like Dulcinea and I like her Cavalier even less, or I don't trust her Cavalier or something. And I think Harrow is suspicious of Dulcinea and also jealous of Dulcinea, but also is like, I think Harrow also has some insight into the situation that she's not sure of, but I think that she's suspicious.
Yeah. And I feel like in the beginning, I thought Harrow's just being a dick, not letting Gideon talk to anyone, but really Harrow's protecting both of them, trying to say like, don't talk to anyone because no one here can be trusted and I don't want any harm to come to you. She would never admit that. But that vow of silence that she kind of like pushes onto Gideon is very much Harrow protecting Gideon from Gideon.
Yeah, and from her, and like protecting herself. Yeah. We also, Harrow gets pretty like friendly in this bit and like tells Gideon what she's up to. And basically what she's been up to, or what she was up to on like the very first night, is she has charted out the entirety of Canaan House and marked every single door and like every single locked door in the whole of Canaan House. And she talks about how there are only 2 lock points, or like points where you can't get into further areas. One of them is the facility, and one of them is this door or whatever marked X22. And she realized that basically teacher was giving them a clue and that she just had to ask for permission and that he would give her a key to go through these doors. And he does give her a key to go through the facility hatch door. But he says that X22 doesn't belong to him and he couldn't give permission. And I don't know if we ever figure out what's behind this door. I don't think it's one of the like locked doors that they later open with the keys they get from the challenges. I think it's basically implying that it's a door that leads to like a whole other area. And given some things that I think Abigail says in Harrow the Ninth, where she makes some sort of comment about how like the Emperor's quarters are like lie like sidelong to the facility or something. I wonder if it's to John's area, or if it's Electo's area, or if it's some what would not belong to teacher,
I think that's a really good theory, because we see all the other quarters, right? There are quarters for every single house, and we don't see, we do know that teacher has his quarters, so unless his quarters are the first's quarters, we haven't seen them.
Well, I think it might be the last room they go to at the end of the book
That's teacher's quarters.
The one where they find Ianthe and Coronabeth and dead Naberius.
Oh, no, I was thinking about where we find the second.
Oh, I was thinking about the room where they find Relitas. We can discuss that.
We'll figure it. We'll put
later.
A pin in that one.
Yeah. We'll put a pin in it. Anyway, it's interesting. I don't really know like what to think about that mention. I'm not sure what is behind that lock point. There's also this really interesting thing that so Gideon convinces Harrow to let her come with her. down into the facility to do these challenges that Harrow has found down there. And Harrow agrees to let her come, but she does warn her. It says, "Down there resides the sum of all necromantic transgression, the unperceivable howl of 10,000 million unfed ghosts who will hear each echoed footstep as defilement." I just don't know how much, because we're everything in this book is from Gideon's perspective. I would love to know like what Harrow knows in this book.
Is it known by all the houses how the resurrection happened? Do all the houses know that there was this mass extinction event?
Yeah, I think in their mythology, it would have been something like, we all died and we didn't deserve it, in a way like we didn't deserve. And so God, aka John, aka the Necrolord Prime, brought us back, like resurrected us with his apparent power. But I think it's more of a mythology. We don't really ever get the nuts and bolts.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know if like I have assumed that Harrow can kind of sense the huge amount of death that happened here, and that there are a bunch of like basically ghosts who are trapped like since the extinction event.
Mm-hmm. I wonder if this is maybe a stretch, but I do kind of wonder if Palamades' confusion around dating things could be because of what was there pre-resurrection and then was resurrected, and the dating of that matter would be kind of messed up. If it like died and then it was resurrected and came back, I don't know if that is confusing whatever signatures he's picking up on stuff.
Yeah, totally. I could see that.
I do want to so Gideon does convince Harrow to like bring her along to help.
Yeah.
But the way that happens, I just think is like maybe the best way to agree and not like to admit that the other person is right without saying it. And Harrow's basically like, I acknowledge your argument. I disagree with it, but I see the margin of error.
Yeah.
Fine. I'm like, I'm going to be using that in my life all the time, and it's going to annoy the hell out of people.
Yes.
Like, Harrow's so salty, like such a little, oh my God, I'm just so into it. I love it so much. And then, of course,
I know, she's such a little bitch.
Yeah, such a little asshole. But it's so funny. It's so good. Yeah, that is a lovely chapter.
Yeah, I really like it. It's just like a little peek into maybe what their relationship could become.
Yep.
I also, this is a little tiny pet theory, Mel, and I know it's a little bit weird, but I wonder if John was a scientist before the extinction event. And basically what happened was he was like a scientist / I don't know, whatever you would need to do to be this, but he was studying necromancy and like found necromancy and realized that what he would have to do to get enough power to do like a resurrection would be to basically cause the extinction event. So it was partially him.
Yeah. I mean, it's curious because I had never thought that necromancy didn't exist pre-resurrection. Somehow I thought that necromancy existed, but not at the level with which it did post-resurrection, and it's that abuse of power that has, the resistors trying to get rid of necromancy and kill off necromancers and whatnot.
Huh.
Because it feels like, there are different levels of necromancy, and you see that in the different skill levels of the different necromancers and whatnot. But what's so fucked up about the 9 houses is that they continue to kill planets. They continue this like conquest and killing planets, and they like keep expanding and expanding and expanding their empire, right?
Yeah.
But it's an abuse of their power. I feel like necromancy existed before John did his thing, but he kind of took it to a whole other level.
Maybe. I'm saying this because Wake says at the very end of Harrow, necromancy is a disease you unleashed. And I took that as meaning like it was John who kind of opened the floodgates.
Yeah, that could be. Then I do think the scientist theory is a good one.
I mean, it's I have no proof, but I'm just like, if this building existed before the mass extinction event and before the resurrection, maybe John was just like a lab dude.
Yeah, a lab bro.
Just your standard lab bro.
Before he was God. Buh.
Yeah. It's just a little pet theory.
All right.
We'll see.
Shall we move on to chapter 14, which is where we really get to see what the challenge is?
Yeah, I don't know about you, Mel, but the first time I read this, I remember being like, wait, what?
Yeah. Oh my God. So confusing. So confusing.
I was so confused by like everything that was happening here. So this is what happens. They go downstairs into the facility, down the hatch, and Harrow's really pissed because basically there's a room and there are two rooms and she has to go into one room and like put her hand in this thing and it traps her hand so she can't move. And then she sends skeletons into this other room, which she can't see, and something destroys them. But she can't like move from where she is to go see what's destroying her skeletons.
Right. But I had to go real slow through this. Spatially, what's going on is there's a main room, and then there are two rooms off of the main room. So there's the main room, and then there's imaging, which is the room that you're talking about, where Harrow has to go in and put her hand in something. And then there's response, which is another room with a window from the main room. So basically, Harrow goes into imaging, waves her hand on that thingy, it gets trapped. Her skeletons are hanging out in the big room. And once her hand is in the thingy, the door to response opens and her skeletons go in, and then that door closes. So there's actually three rooms.
Okay. Yeah.
And so Harrow's basically like, I don't know what is pulverizing my skeletons, and it's like an absurd amount of skeletons that she sends in that just continue to just get pulverized.
Yeah. So Gideon watches it. Now that she has Gideon can like watch what's happening. It turns out it's just this giant ass like monstrosity of a construct that that like appears basically when Harrow puts her hand in that thing and just immediately destroys all of her skeletons. They stand no chance. And Harrow continues to throw skeletons at it and ask Gideon questions about what's happening over and over and over again until Gideon finally just has enough and says and asks Harrow to let her into the room. And Harrow's like, why? And Gideon's like, because its arms looked a little bit like swords. I want to fight it. I feel like Harrow's just like, what?
It's so funny. So Gideon basically, like goes in, like Harrow says no. Harrow's like, no, you're not going to do that just because you want to fight it. And basically Gideon ignores Harrow, and the next time Harrow waves her hand in that thingy, Gideon runs into the room to fight. Gideon trips up the skeletons, which I found was hilarious, and then runs into the room to fight this mega construct. And a couple of things happen when Gideon runs in there. One being, I think when Gideon gets hit, Harrow screams. And so that's like the first clue that there's some sort of connection happening here. And it's confusing because Gideon keeps trying to like ask Harrow what to do, and Harrow is not responding. And we don't really know why, but it turns out that Harrow is trying to... A connection is made between Gideon and Harrow, And that connection basically allows Harrow to perceive what Gideon is experiencing at every layer of Gideon's body. And so Harrow needs to be able to sift through all of that in order to see through Gideon, to be able to see the construct. And the reason why the necromancer in this case has to be able to see is because this construct happens to be held together by multiple theorems.
Right.
And in order to defeat the construct, you have to unweave each theorem in order. And anyone who's not a necromancer can't see the thalergetic signatures that basically tell you where you're supposed to rip apart each theorem. That's what I gathered.
Yeah, no, I think that's it exactly. I think the biggest question that I have about this part is what Gideon sees. Because Gideon sees, I think she calls it a gel overlay across the construct. And I don't know what that means.
It's the theorems.
Do you think it's that she's seen like what Harrow sees when she looks at
Yeah. That's what I gathered. It was like,
yeah.
Which is why, this challenge is basically like giving the necromancer a clue as to how to attain lictorhood. Like, you're going to basically consume your cavalier. And I found this to be like particularly foreshadowy because Gideon is basically Harrow's eyes in this challenge, which is very much what happens in lictorhood, or kind of vice versa, sort of.
Yeah.
And so I think that Gideon can see, in this case, what Harrow can see just as a necromancer.
Yeah.
In her day-to-day life, which is weird.
Yeah, it's so interesting. Yeah, and I think Harrow in like the last chapter says something about how it shouldn't be possible because Gideon mentions that she sees this.
Right.
And Harrow's like, that's not possible. And I do wonder if like say Palamades and Camilla did this, I wonder if Camilla would be able to see it or if there's something special about Gideon that like allows this to happen.
That's possible.
I think that Gideon has... I think Gideon has her own.
She is God's
powers.
Kid. Spoiler alert.
That's huge. That's like end of Harrow huge.
As the child of God, you would think that something has to be magical about Gideon, more so than just like Gideon's biceps.
Oh yeah. Well, I mean, yeah. Gideon's whole body. I think that, I mean, this is definitely a conversation for later, but Gideon has some powers, and I think that where Harrow has thanergetic powers, my suspicion is that Gideon has thalergetic powers.
Can you break that down for our listeners, Amy?
Well, thanergy is death energy, and thalergy is life energy. And I think we see later that God has thalergetic powers as well as thanergetic powers, I believe. And I think that Gideon, being God's accidental kid, has access somehow to this thalergetic power. I don't know if this is true, but I think as we see Gideon kind of display some like interesting and like impossible things. I mean, there are a lot of times where Gideon should be dead, and isn't.
Yep.
Starting from when she was a year old with the Kresh flu.
Right.
I think she has some powers. I don't think they're necromantic though. I think that they're
interesting.
The opposite of necromantic.
Cool.
Yeah.
But so at the end of this chapter, they don't finish the challenge. Basically, Harrow's exhausted, and Gideon's like, we need to take a break.
Yeah, I think she passes out, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Classic. And then And then in the next chapter, so basically they take a long nap and then they get an invitation to go to a dinner party hosted by Magnus and Abigail of the Fifth House. And it really cracks me up how nervous Harrow is to go to this party. Harrow is so smart and then like so good at like sort of the studying and the scholarship and the rigor of this whole situation. But she has a lot of social anxiety.
Of course. Well, she feels that she has the most to hide out of anyone here. You know,
Right.
She's been puppeting her parents. Nobody knows. She's like one of two people in her whole generation. She's got like a lot going on. And so to have to like continue this narrative that all is well and me and Gideon, yes, we are the two correct people that should be here in this challenge. You know, she's like,
Right.
she's really trying to play a part. She's got a lot of walls up. And so I imagine if you have a lot to hide like that and you don't want people to really know who you are, you're going to be real anxious about a dinner party.
For sure. It's completely out of her depth. She does not know how to do this kind of thing. But they do end up going to the dinner party. Mel, this is such a funny chapter.
It's so cute. It's so funny. It's also another example of these like average activities that are happening like in a very not average situation that all of these people are in. But like, hey, we're trying to attain lictorhood and it's like really dangerous and we might die. And also let's have a dinner party where there's a seating chart and we have to sit next to God. When you have to sit next to someone that you don't want to for a whole dinner, it is actually my worst nightmare. And that's what happens. That's what happens to every single person.
I know.
That comes to this dinner party.
Arrangement?
No one wants to be here. And yet
worst.
Everyone is. The only one who seems to want to be there is our Abigail and Magnus. And
Corona Beth, I feel like.
Yeah. Well, this is like what Corona's good at.
Yeah. The girl loves a party.
Mm-hmm. A schmooze. Yeah.
Magnus makes that joke.
Magnus makes the best joke in the whole book, I think, which is the one about what do all the Cavaliers have in common, and he like names them off, you know, Camilla the Sixth, Nibirius the Third, whatever, and he asks, what do all of these Cavaliers have in common? And like everyone, I'm just imagining everyone like rolling their eyes even before he tells the joke, because they're like, why is this man telling a joke? And then he says, they all have the same middle name. And like only Corona Beth really gets it and has like a breakdown because it's so funny.
Really funny.
Teacher doesn't get it and someone has to explain it to teacher and then teacher thinks it's hilarious. I thought it was so funny, but I'm also a sucker for dad jokes.
So funny. I think it's funny because I feel like Magnus is such a type. Oh, I love him so much.
He's also only in his 30s. I think he's in his early 30s. And it's funny because I imagined him to be way older.
Yeah, no, he's in his 30s, I think.
Because actually, a lot of these guys are in their 20s. Or teens, in the case of Gideon and Harrow.
Right. Like, Magnus is our age.
Right, I know. That's why I was like, wait a minute. But I guess I kind of tell jokes like that.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, Mel, you're as nice as Magnus and you tell just as good of jokes.
Thank you. That's, wow, the best compliment I've ever received. I mean, I think the other thing that I was confused about with their ages is the abominable teens. And then you kind of figure out, oh, right, they're not actually like Magnus and Abigail's kids or anything. They're just like Abigail's protege and they're like kind of watching over them. And you learn all this sad shit about the fourth house. But anyway,
yeah,
I just love that Magnus is like in his early 30s and is making these like hardcore dad jokes, and it's just so funny.
He's just such a dad.
Daddy Magnus.
You made a note here about Harrow says something about Gideon's longsword?
Yeah, this is the really beginning of the chapter. I think it's actually before the dinner party. Gideon's complaining that She wants to use her longsword in the challenge.
Oh, right.
And Harrow, says this comment, right? That's like, you're not going to use your longsword, and also I never really liked it anyway. I always felt like it was judging me. Just like a tiny little snippet.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And you like think nothing of it. You're like, whatever. Like, that's weird. You're just like a hypersensitive Debbie Downer. But that's real. The sword was definitely judging Harrow.
It totally is. Yeah, that's a real feeling. I'm surprised that, well, I guess it's just not her thing. Like, she wouldn't sense that there's like a ghost attached to the sword.
No, she's a bone magician. Yeah.
Right. You're right.
But you can sense when someone's like glaring at you, like, behind your back. You kind of, there's that like sixth sense that we all have when someone's.
And Wake is glaring at her.
Right. And so, like, just to clarify, Wake is in this sword, has like latched on to it. Her spirit is there. And Wake is trying to end necromancy. It's like her life's mission. And so, of 100%. Course, she is glaring at Harrow judging her.
Yeah.
But again, we don't figure that out until like late Harrow the Ninth.
Right.
So it's here. It is early on in Gideon the Ninth, and we don't even know.
This is why you need to read these books. I would say the appropriate amount would be 10 plus times.
It's true.
Yeah. Ugh, Mel, it does break my heart, though, because after reading Harrow, reading about Abigail, just the little tiny bits about Abigail at this dinner party, which is really the only time that we meet Abigail in this book. Abigail is just, and like knowing how incredible Abigail is.
Yep.
And then like seeing her here, and then there's a moment where Dulcinea / Cytherea is asking her about her work. And like later you realize, if you look back on this, that what she's realizing is that Abigail needs to go because there's a good chance that she'll figure out that Dulcinea is not Dulcinea. And that moment, it's just like, now when I read it, I'm like, no, don't say anything to her. Like, no.
I know.
Because it really like breaks my heart.
I feel like it's another example where you barely get to know a character in Gideon, and then that character plays a huge role in Harrow.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
There's a couple of those here.
Yeah, and I love that too, because I mean, having read Gideon and like before Harrow came out, there's no way that you could ever have known that like Abigail would ever be a thing.
No, never.
But she's like a main character.
Yep, a main character.
She's so great.
The other thing that kind of comes out here in that conversation with Abigail and Cytherea / Dulcinea is that it sounds to me like the current houses don't actually know that much about the lictors. Abigail says that what we do know about the lictors is very antiseptic, she says. Basically, like, cleaned up. Like, we don't have a lot of details, and that a lot of what we do know is locked up on the sixth house that's written on paper, which needs to be protected.
Right.
And so no one can access it. There's, like, some copies of things or whatever. But it does seem like the general public doesn't actually have a whole lot of information about who the lictors even are and what they're about.
Right. And like there's still the 3 lictors left who are, or I guess 4, who I presumably at some points help the cohort do missions. But I get the feeling that like honestly they're really distracted with the resurrection beasts. So they're like very mysterious, even though technically a couple of them are still around. Yep. Yeah. And I'm sure that like in creating like sort of the mythology that he creates post-resurrection, John probably doesn't want people to really view these folks as like people, as just like normal people.
Right. No, there's power in the myth.
Right.
Yeah. This was like just one area where that was kind of named.
Yeah. What do you think about that bit? There's a bit where Dulcinea is flirting with Gideon, as always. And she says that stuff about the houses are arranged so badly. What do they compete for? The Emperor's favor. What does that look like? What do they want? And then at the end, she kind of trails off. She says, I have been thinking about all that lately, and the only conclusion I can come to is ... And never answers it. What do you think she was going to say?
I have no idea. I reread that. So many times. I mean, it's kind of, I love that bit because it's sort of how I feel in general about the world, where it's like, what are we all competing for? Like, what is the purpose? And so often it's like for the favor of those who are like higher up in a hierarchy than us. And at the end of the day, like, what are you really getting from that?
Right.
And I think that, and again, this continues to come up, there's this reverence towards God, but God is a piece of shit. And I feel like Kithere here knows that. And she's like kind of disgusted by the fact that all of these houses are like competing for the favor of this man who sucks. And who not only sucks, but like killed millions of people for his own purposes, basically, so that he could be immortal. And I feel like she's trying to pathologize the population around like, why are they doing this? And she never finishes this thought. I don't know where she's going with it.
Yeah. I mean, send us your theories, people. What is the end of that sentence?
I mean, the reason we don't hear the end of that sentence is because another kind of bananas things happens, which is Sextus comes up and we basically learn that he's crushing hard on who he thinks of as Dulcinea.
Right.
At this point, this comes out of nowhere. Gideon is kind of shocked by it because, you know, Gideon's been flirting it up with Dulcinea.
Right.
Gideon likes Sextus. Sextus is nice to her.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden realizes, like, the person that Gideon's been flirting with, Sextus also has a thing for.
Right. You know what's weird about this, too, is that he brings Dulcinea tea. And this reminded me of, I remember when I read, there's a short story that Tamsin Muir wrote called, like, The Mysterious Study of Dr. Sex, which is so funny. And it's kind of a weird short story told from Camilla's perspective.
Wait, what? Why have I never heard of this?
You've never read this?
Oh my God.
Oh my gosh, it's on Tor.com. I'll send it to you. But there's one bit where there are some letters exchanged between the real Dulcinea and Palamades, and we read those letters. And in one of them, Dulcinea says that she doesn't like tea. And then Palamades brings her tea in this bit. And I don't know if this, maybe I misread it, but I'm wondering if Palamades is like trying to, I don't think he suspects her of not being Dulcinea. But I'm wondering if he's trying to, like, test her in some way. But it's weird that, like, there would be something that specific in that short story about Dulcinea not liking tea and then and having this. I just feel like it can be.
Yeah, it seems like a thing. I mean, there is that, the conversation between Palamades and Kithere at the very end before he like kind of blows himself up. I feel like we should put a pin in this and talk about it then, because there's a lot that he says in that conversation that might shed a little bit of light onto this moment and at what point he suspected.
Yeah, we'll talk about it then. It's weird to think that he wouldn't have any suspicion at all.
I have a question.
Yeah.
This is one that I have been wondering about for so long. What the fuck is flimsy? What is that?
Well, I mean, it's a paper substitute. I always thought of it as probably like a plastic substitute for paper. So instead of organic-based paper that comes from trees, it's like a petroleum or like a. I mean, I guess that's. Anyways, it's a synthetic.
Interesting.
Paper.
Okay.
I think of it in my head as magazine, but I don't actually think that's correct. But you know what I mean?
Yeah, I've been thinking about it as still paper, but like indestructible. Like it's brown for whatever reason in my head. It's brown and it's like kind of like floppy, but it's indestructible. But I don't know if we ever get a description of what flimsy is, but it's used all the time, and it's just kind of assumed that we know what it is.
Yeah, I think it's some sort of synthetic. It's some sort of synthetic paper, probably like plastic based or something.
Cool. Well, thanks for clearing that up for me, sort of.
Well, I mean, I don't really know, but like I think it's not paper.
Let's finish up with our final chapter for this episode 16, a short chapter but a damning one.
Oh my gosh, so much happens. I guess first of all, they complete the challenge, so they run back down to the facility because apparently Harrow heard Abigail ask what's his name, the shitty 8th guy, Silas. Okay, so
Silas,
Harrow overheard Silas tell Abigail that there's access to the facility. And so now she's all worried because Abigail's smart and like accomplished. And so she's like, let's go down. And honestly, she's right, because we learned that actually Abigail and Magnus did go straight down to the facility after the dinner.
Yep.
So, I mean, yeah, they complete the challenge, which is it's a continuation from the earlier chapter. Harrow is able to tell Gideon where to hit this construct to take it apart. And at the end of the challenge, they get like a little box with a key. And it's really like, it's a cool fight. I think that Tamsin Muir does a really good job at like fight choreography. It's not too much. Like sometimes I feel like fight choreography, it's boring and too long. But she's very quick with it. It's crisp and it's nice. And I think that she had
a consultant.
Yeah, consultant
worked with. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it is good, and it's like it's one of those things that you don't notice unless you've read a lot of sword type stuff.
Yeah.
And this is really, really well done. And it doesn't take over the whole book, but it is the sword play is a really big part of this universe.
Right.
The Cavaliers have swords. It's like a big deal, and it's not overdone. And you're very much with it and following for every kind of sword interaction that there is. But they do win this battle. They get this key. And what happens after is like just this circling back to that fantasy that Gideon had about Harrow like discovering that Gideon's a war hero is like kind of sort of played out here in like a really funny way where it almost feels unbelievable at times, because Harrow's been horrible up until this point, and then is basically like, you are really something else with that sword. I mean, come on. That's like the corniest thing that could have been written, but it's so good.
Yeah, you can tell that she's just like pumped up on adrenaline.
Yeah.
And it's just kind of like word vomiting and is being honestly like really complimentary.
She's like, if I didn't know that, I'd be saying you were Matthias Nonius, come again, or something. So it's like she's just like kind of unloading compliments onto Gideon, and it is shocking for the reader, but also Gideon is like totally shocked by it.
Yeah.
I love it.
I'm merely saying you're an incredible swordswoman. You're still a dreadful human being.
Yeah. Damage done, though, as Gideon says. And we're kind of all basking in this big win and their newfound relationship that doesn't sound so terrible. And then all of a sudden we find the two loveliest characters, Magnus and Abigail, dead at the foot of the ladder.
Right. They're going back up to their quarters having completed this challenge, and they get to the foot of the stairs that go up to the hatch. And Magnus and Abigail are not just dead. They're like really messed up, really cut up, dead at the foot of the stairs. And that's the end. It's like was the crumpled body of Abigail Pent and Magnus Quinn. And that's it. Although I really tried to find this, to find like where I saw this, because I wanted to prove it to you. But I read somewhere, and I'm pretty sure, I'm like 90% sure it's at the end of Act 2. Someone asked Tamsin Muir, was there anything that your editor made you take out or change? And apparently originally when she wrote this, instead of ending it with were the crumpled bodies of Magnus, Quinn, and Abigail Pent, she followed that up with Gideon saying, "Oh, suck a dick." And that was the end.
That would have been a really solid ending. Her editor lets her get away with a lot of stuff. I'm surprised that she didn't get away with that one.
I mean, I feel like it lands a lot harder with just the Magnus and Abigail dead at the foot of the stairs, but just like it would be exactly like what, and I don't know if that's exactly what she said that she wrote, but it was something along the lines of like
something that Gideon
suck a dick or something.
Yeah, totally.
Oh, so funny. Yeah, I mean, it's heartbreaking that Magnus and Abigail are dead, especially once you really get to know them in Harrow. And especially getting to know them as like people who care about Harrow.
Yeah.
I mean, as, you know, as ghosts, but Abigail can never be avenged.
No, and I think this is like really heartbreaking because Magnus was such a nice person to Gideon.
Right.
And I felt really sad for Gideon in that moment. Just being like, damn, like this person is finally nice to Gideon. Gideon finally has someone who's being nice to her and he winds up dead and that sucks.
Right.
Should we wrap it up here? Talk about what's coming?
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for joining us. As always, if you liked listening, please rate and review us wherever you're listening to this podcast. If you have questions or comments or want to point something out, send us a question on our website. It's lockedtombpod.com, or go to our Twitter @lockedtombpod. We would love to hear from you. I'm Amy.
I'm Mel.
And we'll see you next time here at the Locked Tomb Podcast.